Hello and welcome into the Hecklers Podcast. I am your host, Gordon Coletto, and joining me once again is my co-host, Billy. Billy, it has been quite a while. How are you doing?
I'm great, honestly. I'm looking forward to 4th of July and I'm ready to get after it. The way that our founding fathers would want us to.
Exactly. I love that. The weather has been real hot here in Charlotte, so hopefully a good chance to get outside, get to the pool, smoke some meats, do whatever you love. And hopefully get to enjoy some more NFL offseason. Hopefully, some moves coming to keep us engaged and entertained. I know that we have done a lot of discussion of the offensive side of the ball on this show, so I wanted to dedicate an entire episode, today's episode, to the defensive side of the ball. There were a number of key free agent moves this offseason on defense. So I want to dive into some of those and give our predictions for the best defenses in the league as well as the worst defenses, things that we can kind of expect coming into this season. So I wanted to start our discussion today with something that I'm sure is close to your heart, Billy. The Giants, in one of the bigger moves this offseason, traded for Brian Burns from the Panthers and then signed him to a 5-year, $141 million deal. So I want to start with this. What type of player can Giants fans expect, and how does he fit what they are trying to build on defense?
So I think for Giants fans, you're hoping Kayvon Thibodeau is the number one pass rusher because Brian Burns is not that guy. In his career, in 2022, he had 12 and a half sacks. That's the most he's had in his career. That was the year after Hassan Reddick left for the Eagles. But outside of that, he's had 7.5, 9, 9, and 8. So he's a talented player, um, but he's not going to produce the way that you want him to. Now, since I said that, he's going to get like 16 or 17 sacks this season, um, just because he's not on the Panthers anymore. But this is a guy who, how many games have we watched together where we both have said Brian Burns is about to disappear? When you need him most, he's not there. He tries to rely on his athleticism. He wants to use a spin move every other pass rush. And the stats speak for themselves. He's just not as productive as he's being paid for. And it was disappointing to watch him for 5 seasons with the Panthers because the way everybody in the media talks about him, you would think he's, on the verge of being a top five pass rusher. But that's just not who he is. He's a complimentary pass rusher, a guy who you'd love to have as your number two pass rusher, but as a number one pass rusher, he leaves a little to be desired.
So I think you're absolutely right when you said that as somebody who's watched a lot of Brian Burns being here in Charlotte, that he disappears at times in games. I think a lot of times what you'll see is Brian Burns will get a sack early in a game and then he just won't get another QB hit the rest of the game. And you're like, what happened? Where did he go? Right. And when a lot of times when you're watching plays, you're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, why is this guy giving up on plays? It seems like he goes for that first pass rush move, and if it fails, he just sort of gives up and just gets tangled up with the tackle, or whoever is blocking him. And to me, that was a really frustrating experience because he just doesn't seem to have that drive to keep attacking and trying to find a way to the quarterback that you see in some of these really doggish defensive ends and outside linebackers, these really prominent pass rushers. The other thing I would mention that I think is important when you look at the combination of Kayvon Thibodeau and Brian Burns is it creates a deficit on the outside when it comes to run stopping, right? So obviously having Dexter Lawrence up the middle means that nobody's really going to be running up the middle against you, right? They're going to attack the edges. And one thing the Panthers learned when they had Hassan Reddick, Brian Burns, and Derek Brown kind of equally, if not better, of a run stopper than Dexter Lawrence, right?
He's a top run stuffer in the league, but Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that the Panthers learned though, right, was that they were incredibly vulnerable to the run game at the edges when you have two sort of speed rusher guys who are not good at stopping the run. And I worry that that's kind of what the Giants are building for themselves, in terms of having Kayvon Thibodeau and Brian Burns and then Dexter Lawrence up the middle. I love the raw talent that they have on the team, the pedigree that they have on the team, but I definitely worry about how teams may approach running towards the boundaries against that defensive line.
Especially in a division where you have the Eagles, who we know are going to try and just run all the time.
Yep.
It's going to be interesting to see. I just that was a lot of money to give a guy who, as I said, I believe he's a number two pass rusher.
Well, and with that, there was another guy who got paid this offseason from the same draft class, same position in Josh Allen, who also got roughly, I think his was 5 year, 140 million, right? So this was the one up contract for Burns. The question I would have is if you were sort of starting from scratch, if you were the Giants and you were choosing between Brian Burns and Josh Allen, which one would you rather have?
Been going back and forth on this because so I mentioned this amount of sacks that Burns had. He's going to give you, 8 to 10 a season is pretty much what he's done throughout his career. Whereas you have Josh Allen, who's had 10.5, 2.5, 7.5, 7.5, and 17.5.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the consistency is, you know, up in the air with Josh Allen, but you've seen that top end production at 17.5. So I think I'm going to give the edge to Josh Allen.
I mean, the other thing I would mention with Josh Allen, is really his tackle numbers generally are higher than Brian Burns across the board. And when you look at his QB hits, he's producing more QB hits. And granted, 2023 is a statistical outlier for, for Josh Allen, right? So I don't want to put too much weight into it, but at the same time, Brian Burns has never put together a season that good, even when he was at his best. So I do think that at this point, like, you have to bet on what Josh Allen has shown from a pop perspective versus the known commodity of what Brian Burns can be. Because I do agree, like, obviously Brian Burns over the course of, their full, so what has it been now, 5 years, right? Brian Burns generally averages a little bit more, but then, of course, like, you just don't know what to make of 2023, and I think you have to pay the guys according to what they did in 2023, which in that case, right, to me, it says Josh Allen was deserving of the contract he got, and to me, Brian Burns was not. Um, but, both of them two-time Pro Bowlers. Of course, Josh Allen won Rookie of the Year. So, it can be splitting hairs. They're very similar players, but I just think that the edge goes to Josh Allen. All right. Keeping with our theme of pass rushers, I want to bring in another guy who was also a defensive rookie of the year in Chase Young, who lands with the Saints. To me, Chase Young feels like a player who is bouncing around based off of his draft pedigree and based off of his rookie of the year status and not really his performance on the field. Not only has he failed to stay healthy, which is a huge issue for him. But also, he's failed to reach double-digit sacks in any season, right? So we just talked about two guys who have each had double-digit sack seasons, and Chase Young has never even been there. Yet he seems to get a lot more respect. And also, when you look at the tackle numbers for Chase Young, he is also really not good. In terms of, he had 15 tackles last year. Of course, only started 6 games, but that's an alarming number. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on Chase Young and about this signing.
Chase Young is a bum. So, considering all the talent that was on the Washington defensive line when he was there, he was playing opposite Montez Sweat, the defensive tackles that were there. And then on top of that, he gets traded to the 49ers, arguably the best situation he could have been in, and he doesn't produce. Like you said, the most amount of sacks he's had, 7.5. He's never reached double digits. You're telling me he played against played with arguably the best defensive end in the league, and he couldn't get sacks? I mean, especially because the 49ers played with the lead most of the time. And it's just, he's so frustrating. Like, I don't understand. He was touted as this prospect. He was, can't miss. This is the best defensive end prospect we've seen in how long? And he just hasn't produced. I mean, even if you believe the notion with Julius Peppers that he was taking plays off, didn't care that much, the man still got 160 sacks in his career. So is Chase Young really just sandbagging it that much, or is he just not that talented? It's probably a combination of both.
You know, I think the difficult thing about a guy like Chase Young is the pedigree is so enticing for teams. And I think that's why he continues to find jobs in the league, right? And you talked about effort and a lack of effort, which was sometimes on display, especially in San Francisco, when you look at the stakes of what they were doing. What I will say for the Saints' benefit is a 1 year, $13 million contract. You've said it a lot. There's no such thing as a bad 1 year deal. I do think it's very much a prove it deal, right? In the sense of you're not overcommitting, right? So if we look at that Brian Burns contract, right, that's $28 million a year. You're paying less than half of what teams are paying for premier rushers, which, I mean, we talk about those guys are not even really premier, right? Those guys are, twos at best, right? So I think the value is fine. I have no problem with the value of the contract at 13 million. I think that that's reasonable. I just think, especially for a Saints team that needs help on the defensive line, that needs to get younger, right? Chase Young is still, I believe, only 25 years old, right? So if you happened to and hit really well with Chase Young, right, you may have just saved yourself from having to try to find your next defensive end in the draft, and you may have just found a guy that you can re-sign and things like that, right, and get your hands on him, right? I think that that's what teams want to do with a guy like this. The hard part for me, though, is how do you what should the expectation be for Chase Young at this point, right? Like, if he goes out there and puts together a 7-sack season, is that enough, right? For you to say, okay, this guy is worth keeping around, especially if he starts wanting more and more money. So, I don't hate the deal for the Saints in the sense of the value of the contract and taking a swing, but what I do not like is Chase Young, the player. I don't think there's any meat on that bone.
Well, and how many years are we going to give him to produce before we call him what he is? He's a bust. He's a rotational player at best. And even like Jadeveon Clowney, the knock on him up until I believe it was last year was his first 10-sack season was that he never gets double digit sacks. Jadeveon Clowney was a fantastic run defender though. And
Mm-hmm.
Chase Young's horrible against the run. What is he giving you? I
Yeah.
mean, you're paying and I there's no such thing as a bad 1 year deal. But this guy's not the future of anyone's defensive line. He's just not.
Well, and I think I like that you brought up Jadeveon Clowney because I think that that is probably where a lot of people would turn to in terms of, right, a similar draft profile in terms of pedigree, and then kind of a similar, I hesitate to say it, but like a disappointment, right, where Jadeveon Clowney, right, it's the health issues, he's not living up to being this amazing pass rusher, right? And you're like, everyone thinks J.J. Watt, Jadeveon Clowney, this is just going to be a quarterback's nightmare, right? And it's like, well, he just never really turns out. And then he just, since 2019, he's just kind of been bouncing around the league, right? I think it's a really good comparison. And I do think Jadeveon Clowney makes the case for himself with his sack numbers that you can almost, in a healthy season, predict roughly 9 sacks from him, and you're going to get in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 tackles. You're not getting that from a Chase Young. From a Chase Young, you're maybe getting 5 and, 20, 25 tackles, and that's just
Right,
not
but
good enough.
Clowney's offering you elite run defense.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying from the tackles,
Whereas,
right? You're getting twice as many tackles out of him.
Right. Whereas Chase Young is a liability against the run.
Yeah, and that's fair. But I do think again though, like if you're the Saints, like what do you have to lose, right? Like you're not, you needed a defensive end, right? It's the same thing because the Panthers, I believe, took Jadeveon Clowney, right? Is
I
he?
believe so.
Yeah, yeah.
Let
So
me.
yeah, he's playing for the Panthers now. He's who replaced Brian Burns' production, right? So now you look at it and it's like, the Panthers, they need a defensive end. Jadeveon Clowney is kind of a plug and play guy, right? Like I think Chase Young, I think the hope is that he can be a plug and play guy like that. I don't think anybody's going to expect him to live up to being, a premier pass rusher, but you do hope that he's a plug and play guy. Not to mention he did win Rookie of the Year, so I think a lot of teams will give him credit for that.
Why it's a faulty rookie of the year.
Why is that?
Because Jeremy Chin had the better season. So I've got Chin's stats pulled up. So his rookie year, he had the first combined tackles, 117 tackles. He had two fumble recoveries, five pass defended, two forced fumbles, and he had two defensive touchdowns. And you're telling me Chase Young, who had, let's see, he had 7.5 sacks, four forced fumbles, three recoveries, and 44 tackles, should have been rookie of the year. He got that off of the position that he plays and his name, and that's the only reason that he won that award.
I mean, I, I can't I can't argue against the stats. I do think that Chin was incredibly deserving, and really should have got Rookie of the Year. But at the end of the day, like, I mean, the awards, they're nice, but they don't mean anything, right? Like that was given to
No, I
him
mean,
primarily based on notoriety, right?
right. I mean, neither one of their careers turned out,
Well, I was
but
gonna, and
this
that's
is a faulty award.
well, and that's the thing too, right? So you look at Chin, right? He has that amazing rookie season, and then you look at his sophomore campaign, and honestly, it's not bad. It doesn't jump out at you the same way. Well, actually, I mean, the tackles still up there at 107, but then it's like year 3 and 4 where you're supposed to be taking this leap to stardom, right? He just falls off the map. When really year 4 is when he really falls off the map. So the question I have for you would be, because this is another guy who has moved teams this offseason. What was that first year and second year a fluke, or is there a good player still there? And if so, who do you blame for Chin's lack of production slash development in the latter half of his rookie contract?
So, I mean, I remember his second year in the league. That's when they moved him back to safety, and he struggled in coverage. I think, when you have these guys who don't necessarily have a position, and it's, oh, we're going to play positionless football, it doesn't really work, right? Like, there's few guys who can actually do that. And even when they do, it's, they end up playing, cornerback 85% of the time, and the other time they're kind of moving around. Like, they've done that with Jalen Ramsey, where typically, he's guarding the best receiver or he's on the outside. Sometimes they'll bump him into the slot, but it's not like a 50-50 split. So you take these guys who don't have a position and you say, okay, well, we're going to, either force you into position or play positionless football. And it just doesn't really work. I think, he's a backup, special team or rotational guy, but outside of that, I don't think there's much there. And I think to blame for his development, it's Matt Rule and Phil Snow. I mean, they were horrible. Tommy Tremble came out and said that, they never corrected anyone when Matt Rule was the head coach. It was just, oh, go do this. Well, if no one's correcting you and helping you get better, it's just going to stay stagnant. And I think that's part of what happened with Chin.
I mean, so certainly I won't discredit the dysfunction of Carolina throughout Chin's time there, and that's not to dunk on Carolina, right? That's just everybody knows that things have been dysfunctional there. You
It's
know,
the worst run franchise in the league right now.
exactly. And I think Chin certainly could be viewed as a victim of that. I think that there's a lot of underperforming that went on within that organization throughout the Matt Rule era and really the Tepper era as a whole. And certainly moving Chin around felt like it was hurting him, right? Like they never seemed to recapture that sort of like my thing about Chin is I'm sure that he would be a lot like Kyle Duggar, a really good in the box safety. Somebody who can track down the run and stuff the run. I don't want him playing a ton of coverage. Like I don't think that is going to be good for him. So when you look at where he's going to be in Washington, right? I'm looking at their depth chart now. They currently have him as the strong safety, right? So he's going to be playing that sort of in the box, close to the line of scrimmage. I think that that'll be good for him. Like I don't think he needs to be playing a coverage safety role. Um, so I'd be curious to see how he's able to bounce back in that box safety role and whether or not he can find that same level of production, particularly in the run game that you talked about, where this guy is just so good at tracking guys and taking great angles to them and is just a hard-nosed player. So I would love to see Chin get back to that because I love the player and especially those first 2 years in Carolina, just really fun guy to watch play. A lot like Frankie Louvu, who also went to the Commanders. So clearly they have a plan to basically just become Carolina at Mid-Atlantic. I don't know. Um,
Yeah, I was thinking Mid Atlantic too.
so, to me, it's interesting. I'd be curious to see. I'm not willing to give up on the player yet. I bought a share of him in fantasy football um, because I'm not ready to give up on the player. I think that we've seen good production there, and I just think the dysfunction of Carolina will really hurt him. So, um,
I just think it's one of the, like Chase Young, for instance, where it's like, okay, it's been 4 seasons. How much more are you really going to get? Like, what level of player are you hoping for? Because I just like an elite player that people thought, especially Young, but after Chin's rookie year, that it's like, oh, there could be something special here. I don't think that's happening anymore.
well, but I mean, the value of box safeties across the board is down, right? Like you
Oh
look
yeah,
at
I mean that's a part-time position.
the Jamal Adams deal looks so bad in hindsight for the Seahawks that it's really changed how teams approach the position, right? Like you look at Kyle Duggar, who is probably one of the league's premier box safeties. It's just the money's not there. The interest in keeping these and Duggar wanted to test his value on the open market, and there just was no market for him. So the Patriots paid him, a reasonable amount to bring him back, right? So I just think the position's not that important anymore. And I think though if you can get Chin to just do what he does well and take it for what it is and work it into your scheme, then that's a good thing, right? Like I'm not as big on I think it's different for somebody like Chase Young, right? Who the defensive end is such a critical role in your defense that you need them to play at an incredibly high level, right? Whereas a box safety, if I can get somebody who can really support my run game, um, and come in on clear, running downs, then I'm happy with that, right? Like I'm happy with having that guy out there, and that's why I wanted the Patriots to keep Duggar around, right? It's a lot of money to spend for a box safety just in general, right? You don't like to spend if you don't have to, but those guys are really valuable in terms of just building out your run stopping ability. So with that, I want to transition into another member of the secondary, a safety who is a coverage expert, I would say, in Xavier McKinney, who signed with the Packers on a 4-year, $68 million deal. So I'll ask you, in your eyes, what does this move by the Packers signal to you?
So for the Packers, to me, it signals that they feel that they're ready to compete. So I mean, obviously they made a little bit of a playoff run last year, but they've watched Jordan Love and they're like, okay, we've got our guy. We've got some young pieces. Let's bring in some free agents, specifically McKinney, to help with this, and hopefully this can make us one of the contenders in the NFC. I worry about it from the Packers standpoint in that McKinney has missed a lot of time in his career. So, uh, first season in the league, he played 6 games, and then his third season, he only played 9. So he's had 2 healthy seasons out of the 4, and that gives me some concern. They pay him a lot of money, and is he going to show up on Sundays?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, it's an inherent risk for any team that takes on a player with an injury history. I do think the upside is just it's really hard to ignore. Um, this move to me reminds me a lot of when the Packers signed Charles Woodson. They're not a team who signs big name free agents unless they genuinely think they are ready for a title run. So to me, this move really signals a belief in their core group of players, a belief in Jordan Love, and a belief that they're ready to compete now, right? So when I think about it, I think it's a good way to, you have Jair Alexander, assuming CTE doesn't take him out of the game. You now have Xavier McKinney. Like, I think they have a really good secondary. Their defensive line continues to sort of play really good football. So to me, their defense has gotten better. They're saying we're going to answer what our offense is able to do, and I really like it. I'm bullish on the Packers this year. I think that a lot of people are going to look at the Lions to win that division. I think the Packers have built something really good with that core group of receivers. They've added Josh Jacobs. They've got Jordan Love. I think that the Packers as a whole are going to be very good. And I think the defensive improvements are going to be a big part of that. And I think what they're basically saying, right, is that we have a recognition that defense still doesn't necessarily win championships, but plays a big role in winning championships. And we're going to build a good defense. We are going to have a good secondary to help limit the threats of the Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allens of the world. And we are going to focus on playing solid football, and hopefully our offense can overpower some of these other teams. So to me, I love the deal. I think the Packers are ready to compete. I'm curious what you think about where the Packers are at, where the NFC North is at.
I feel like I've just been negative this whole podcast, and I'm going to keep that going. I need to see more out of Jordan Love. Like half a season of football, of good football, I'm not ready to, anoint him like everyone else is. Um, so I need, talk about Christian Watson. He's missed time with injury. He was probably the fourth receiver on the team last year. I think he's got a lot of potential, but he keeps getting hurt. So I would just like to see them put together. I need to see more time, right? Like, was that a flash in the pan, those last 8 to 10 games, including the playoffs? Was that game against the 49ers in the playoffs? Is that more realistically what they are? So that's kind of my thing. I just, it's a little up in the air for me. I still think it's the Lions' division to lose. And I think the Lions should win the division.
So, like, okay, so obviously the theme of the podcast is sort of, 1 year wonders or, flash in the pan seasons, right? And it's like, okay, how do you then judge? I feel like seeing Jordan Love get better as the season went on and where he finished, assuming that they can keep that momentum going in the offseason, which guys do, especially at the quarterback position, I see no reason why he can't come into this season and just pick up where he left off. Like, you're talking just incredible numbers, right? Okay, so if you look at it, 4,100 yards, 64% completion percentage, 32 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. If this was his true rookie season, we would be talking, he would already be anointed in most people's eyes, right? That would be a record breaking rookie season. But because he's a third year player who at this point has only had one
Fourth year
start,
player.
well, he'll be a fourth year player now.
No, this is fifth year.
Is that right?
I'm pretty sure.
2021, 2022, 2023. I guess he had no stats in 2020, so that's why it's not appearing on his sheet. But fair enough,
Maybe
right?
I was wrong.
But because he's further into his career, right? This isn't the NBA where you get, a rookie season whenever you finally start to play. Like, it's I don't know. To me, there's so much there. I'm excited about it. I think that they're absolutely set up. I love the coaching. I love the players they have. I think Jordan Love absolutely has the talent to do it, and I think he's just going to pick up where he left off. And I get why you're hesitant, right? Because we've talked about guys all podcast long who have had one season where they have flashed, and then the rest of them they peter out, and they're not special after that. I totally get that. I just feel like at the quarterback position, that happens less.
I just don't like when, guys will have a great season and it's like, this is, the next great thing. This guy is, I'm going to put him as top 3 in my quarterback ranking. And I'm like, okay, I've, seen Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, and Patrick Mahomes play 4 and 5 years and do this consistently, even though Burrow gets hurt. And I'll put Lamar in there. They're all, they're always up in that conversation. And that's more of my thing where it's, sometimes Dak is in that conversation and he falls out. Sometimes, insert whatever quarterback is in that conversation and they fall out. So that's where I want to see him string together more games.
And here's the thing. I'm normally with you. I'm normally the guy who says I cannot stand when we anoint people, but normally it's because they're assholes, right? Like the thing is, I'm rooting for Jordan Love because Aaron Rodgers was an asshole, and this is the guy taking over for him. This is the guy who pissed off Aaron Rodgers when he got drafted, right? Like I love Jordan Love because of what he represents in terms of moving on from Aaron Rodgers, who I perceive as an asshole. So in that sense, I'm okay with him being anointed as the next great thing because I can't stand Aaron Rodgers. So I want to wrap up our discussion today by really looking at the overall landscape of the league and who we think might stand out or disappoint defensively this season. So I want to give you the first word on this. Who do you think will prevail as the top defense in the league this season?
So the only thing I'm going off of is my childhood, and I miss when this was a thing. I want the Steelers to have the top defense in the league. I mean, they've got T.J. Watt, they've got Alex Highsmith, they still have Cam Hayward. He's getting older. Still have Minkah Fitzpatrick. So there are a lot of pieces still there, and I just when the Steelers and the Ravens were just dominant defensively, that's when football was at its peak for me. So I want the Steelers to be at the top.
Now, the Steelers also added, I believe, Patrick Queen and Peyton Wilson in the draft. So they've certainly
See, there's so many pieces I can't even remember all of them, which is why they should be the top defense.
And I'm going to stay in the same division as you, and I'm going to say the Ravens. The Ravens, even though they lost Patrick Queen, they still have a really, really good defense. And the thing I really like about it in terms of predicting who will be the top defense is less about the individual talented players, which I've said they have plenty of talent, right? Marlon Humphrey, you look at Kyle Hamilton, Roquan Smith. It's a really good team, but the thing that I really love about this is when you look at their schedule, they have a record-breaking schedule in terms of rest days. They will be one of the most rested defense to play every single weekend because of the way that their schedule worked out with Christmas games, Thursday games, Monday games. So they are going to have an enormous amount of rest all season long, which means they're going to be bringing in fresh legs. So to me, and the Ravens were already a really good defense last year. I don't have the ratings up in front of me, but I'm pretty sure they were top 10. So to me, I really think that they could easily become the number one defense in the league, partly just based on how much rest they're going to have. The next thing I want to talk about are the possibility of most improved defense, and I'm going to throw out the Commanders for this spot. So for a few different reasons, some of which we've touched on already in this podcast, but they landed a defensive-minded head coach who I think is probably a top 5 defensive coach in the game today. So I really like that addition, and then I also love the addition of Jeremy Chin and Frankie Louvu from your Panthers. I really expect this team to be competitive. I think they've invested in the defensive side of the ball. I think the offense is going to be better, which is going to give the defense more rest, more time off the field in game to be able to get ready for their next series. So I really like what they've done. I think they have a good chance to improve drastically on defense. Billy, who do you have here?
I'm going to go with the Seahawks.
Hmm.
So they went after a defensive head coach or defensive coordinator who's now their defensive head coach. Um, or I should say defensive minded. And I mean, he had the Ravens defense playing really well last season.
Yep.
They've got some young pieces in the secondary. I just think, I mean, they were a horrible defense last year, so it's kind of hard to not go up. But I think they could be, middle of the pack to top 12, just depending on how things work out.
Talk about great defenses from our childhood, right? Not necessarily our early childhood, but our teen years. Those Seattle defenses were very,
This
very
is the
good.
bane of my existence.
Yep. So it would be great to see, I think, Seattle playing that style of football again, where they are just really, really tough defensively. And
I
then,
do
of
have an
course,
honorable mention one, if I
oh, I
can
love
throw that
that.
out there.
Yeah.
The Eagles. So they did lose Fletcher Cox, and he was getting a little long in the tooth. But they added, and of course now his name is
Cooper
who
DeJean.
was their well, obviously. Um, I got to look up their defensive coordinator. I just like blanked on his name. Vic Fangio.
Hmm.
So his defense is always, he always turns the defense around, makes them better. They've got some young pieces. Still a little concerned about the secondary. Obviously, Cooper DeJean's going to help with that, and they added Gardner Johnson back, so that'll help with their secondary as well. I mean, I'm interested to see what those defensive tackles can produce. I just think there's a lot of talent on that defense, and them being ranked 26th in the league, I think they can do better.
Well, I mean, it's certainly not harder to do better than what Fat Patricia can put out on the field.
Yeah,
I guess he's not so Fat Patricia anymore, but I'm still
it
gonna.
just works though. We're
It
gonna keep calling
works.
them that.
Yeah, I think you have to. Um, well, I love that. I do. The Eagles are one that I thought about. I loved that Cooper DeJean pick. Um, so the last thing that we'll get into is who we think is going to disappoint or really fall off from what they did last season. I'll let you have the first word here, and then I'll round us out.
I'm gonna pick the easiest one, and that's the Dolphins. So they were top 10 defense in terms of yards. They lost Christian Wilkins. They lost Vic Fangio. They've got Bradley Chubb and Jordan Phillips coming back from, I believe they both tore their Achilles. But those injuries are hard to come back from. I just think that defense is going to plummet.
I think that that's a really good choice. That was one that I considered as well. I think that everything you've mentioned is incredibly important, right? Losing Christian Wilkins is a really big deal. So, and then of course Vic Fangio brings a lot of experience to the team, so that's another tough loss. But I do think getting Bradley Chubb back will help. So it's just kind of it's kind of a can you match what you lost kind of thing. But I do think basically by default they're not going to be as good. Um, I, I wasn't sure about this. What's funny is so I'm going to go with the Patriots. And the funny thing is I originally had them in my most improved category. But then I started to kind of think about how this season might look from a narrative standpoint, meaning, okay, how can I actually see the season going? Which is Jacoby Brissett is starting. You have Drake May, who's probably going to take up the reins at the midway point of the season, if not a little bit earlier, right? So you kind of expect the defense to do a lot of playing, and they have one of the single hardest schedules in the league, if not the hardest schedule in the league. I know it kind of runs against my point that I made with the Ravens, but they do have a lot of rest time, which is nice, but they are just playing an absolute gauntlet of a schedule. So I think that really hurts the defense. I like the things that they did this offseason, bringing back Christian Barmore. Well, not even bringing back, but signing him to an extension, bringing back Kyle Duggar, like I said earlier. Matthew Judon is going to come back healthy. Christian Gonzalez hopefully will be back and be healthy, and he was a shutdown corner for the 4 games that he was healthy. So there's a lot to be excited about as a Patriots fan, but that schedule scares the hell out of me. So for me, I think because I'm so high on them because of everything I mentioned, I'm expecting personally to be let down by how hard the schedule is for this defense. So to me, the Patriots are a team that I look at to disappoint. I know I did some redraft leagues, and defense is not a sexy thing in a redraft league, but I'll mention it that the Patriots were one of those teams that was going significantly, and I say significantly, about 30 spots higher than their ADP. So, their ADP was about 30 spots higher than what their ranking was. So that's just an interesting note. It does seem like a lot of people are bullish on the Patriots defense, but I would expect them to disappoint just based on their strength of schedule.
Well, and especially, I mean, just looking at the division, those are going to be some pretty good offenses. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the divisional games are usually tougher, but.
And you lose Bill Belichick, you lose Steve Belichick. Those are hard things to do. Those are hard things to come back from. That's a lot of defensive experience that left the building. I know Gerard Mayo's there and there's a lot of continuity, but you still worry about that. Bill Belichick, for all of his flaws, is an incredible defensive coach, and he knows the X's and O's. He knows 24-year-olds. He knows how to speak the language and get these guys going. So with that does it for us today. Please don't forget to rate and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. You can also keep in touch with us through email at hecklerspod